As I sat alone in the dimly lit study, shadows stretching across the walls, I reflected on just how much my life had shifted. Not too long ago, I thought I had everything: an established career, a cozy home, and a devoted wife. Now only the job and the house were left. My thoughts drifted to Beverly, my wife of almost 5 years. We'd met at Harper Investments, where she'd started in an admin role before advancing to work directly under my boss, Mason Harper, as his executive assistant. It was about 7 months ago when Mason, Alan Harper's son, began making moves to eventually take over the family business. Although he still had some time before becoming CEO, Mason's rapid rise to regional manager signaled that he was next in line. Alan had always earned my respect, especially with how he'd helped me adjust to civilian life after I returned from overseas with a serious injury. During my recovery, he recognized my potential and offered me a role at the company. I had just completed my finance degree, so I took his offer and joined Harper Investments 8 years back. Since then, I completed my recovery, earned my MBA, and eventually met Beverly, who would later become my wife. Alan even generously funded our honeymoon in the Caribbean, showing his continued support. A few years later, Mason entered the company. Unlike his father, Mason had a blunt, abrasive manner that often clashed with the other staff. One day, Alan confided in me. "Sooner or later, I'll need to make Mason the regional manager," he said. "I need someone to help guide him. Think you're up for it?" "I'll do what I can," I replied, though I knew it wouldn't be easy. "Be honest, Albert. What do you really think of him?" Alan asked. "He's arrogant, doesn't listen to advice, and frankly, Beverly thinks he's heading for a harassment suit," I admitted. Alan sighed. "That's what I feared. His mother spoiled him, and I was hoping he'd mature. I'll try talking to him. By the way, when's Bob planning to retire?" "Bob Jenkins, the current regional manager, plans to leave in about 6 months. He's already got a place lined up in Montana," I answered. Alan promised to keep me in the loop before he left my office. A few months later, Bob retired, and Mason stepped into the role. He implemented some useful changes, but his tendency to micromanage quickly created friction among the staff. One day, Mason came to my office with an unexpected proposal. "I'm thinking of hiring a new executive assistant, and I think Beverly would be perfect," he said casually. "You mean my wife, Beverly?" I asked, caught off guard. "Yes, Gretchen's leaving soon, and Beverly has the drive and skills we need in that role," Mason explained. "Did you talk to Beverly about this yet?" I asked. "Not yet. I wanted to get your take first," he replied, with a slight smirk. "By the way, what's she like at home?" His tone made me uncomfortable. "Beverly and I are happily married, and she's a consummate professional. If you think she's a good fit, it's her decision to make. But don't forget, she's my wife," I said firmly. "Of course, Albert. I respect you both," Mason replied with a grin that didn't quite seem genuine. Then he added, "This could even lead to a promotion for you." That night, I brought it up with Beverly. "Did Mason talk to you today?" "Yes. He mentioned the executive assistant role," she replied. "What do you think?" "Well, it would mean more hours and travel, but the pay increase would help us save for the future," she said, thinking it over. "Are you sure about this? I've heard the rumors about him. But do you trust me?" she asked, meeting my eyes. "I trust you, absolutely, but I don't trust him. He asked about our personal life today, which didn't sit well with me," I admitted. She shrugged. "That's just Mason being Mason. So what did you tell him?" "I told him you're amazing and that we're happily married," I replied. She looked reassured and nodded. I think I'll take the job. We went to bed, though a subtle tension lingered. After accepting the role, Beverly started traveling every other week and often worked late. I supported her, telling myself there was no reason to worry. Then, a little over 3 months ago, Alan suffered a sudden stroke and passed away, leaving the company reeling. At his funeral, Mason anticipated being appointed CEO, but the board chose Laura Matthews as interim CEO due to his lack of experience. Frustrated, Mason pushed himself harder, which meant he demanded more from Beverly, too, adding to her workload and travel. Under this strain, our relationship began to fray. Beverly grew distant. She started dressing more provocatively and seemed more on edge, snapping at minor things. One Sunday evening after she returned from a trip to Boston, I finally addressed it. "Beverly, we need to talk." "About what?" she snapped, clearly annoyed. I was taken aback, but tried to keep calm. "Are things okay between us?" She sighed. "Things are fine. It's just the workload." She went silent, then nodded. "You're right. I'll talk to him tomorrow." The next day, she came home looking cheerful. "Mason said we can take next week off, but he wants us to attend a party at his place Friday night." "A party? What kind?" "Just a casual get-together with a few friends," she replied, shrugging. I agreed, on the condition that she'd come home on time for the rest of the week. On Friday night, I dressed casually, watching as Beverly prepared. Her dress was shorter and more revealing than anything she'd worn before, and she wasn't wearing a bra. The dress hugged her figure with slits up the sides and an open back, giving her a bold look. "You look incredible," I said jokingly. "But maybe we should stay in." She laughed. "Later. How do you like the dress?" "It's stunning, but it doesn't seem very casual," I noted. "Mason suggested I wear it tonight," she said, grinning. "Relax. Everyone knows their boundaries." "They'd better," I replied, hugging her. When I leaned in to kiss her, she pulled back. "Don't mess up my makeup." We arrived at Mason's townhouse. As we stepped inside, I immediately noticed the faint smell of marijuana. Mason introduced me to 3 men, Sam Whitaker, Tony Fleming, and Dave Jensen, who handled the Jennings account. "Guys, this is Albert," Mason announced, "and this is Sam, Tony, and Dave." I shook hands with each of them, feeling a bit uneasy. "My God, Beverly, you look stunning in that dress," Mason said as he glanced at her. Beverly did a little twirl, almost modeling it, and I felt a flicker of irritation. Mason handed us drinks, white wine for Beverly, and something for me, even though I'd mostly stopped drinking years ago. Still, I took small sips, wanting to keep a clear head. Mason came back with the drinks, and Beverly immediately took a big sip, while I sipped mine carefully, wanting to keep my mind clear. Mason invited me to drink with him, but instead I guided everyone to the living room, where Beverly quickly picked a seat on a small love seat. Mason joined her without hesitation, sitting beside her, and I took a chair across from them, keeping a close eye on things. "Old habits die hard," Mason said with a smirk, settling in next to her. "No problem," I replied, though seeing him so close to my wife didn't sit right with me. The conversation flowed, and after a while, Mason started asking about my military background. "My dad was a military man, and so was I," he began. "My dad used to say the same about you, Beverly." I nodded, mentioning I'd served for 5 years before being medically discharged. "Did you see action?" Sam asked, curiosity gleaming in his eyes. I nodded briefly, trying to keep it light. Beverly looked at me, surprised. "You never told me that," she said. "It's just not something I talk about much," I replied. Tony then pulled out a bag of marijuana and rolled a joint, passing it around. When it reached me, I declined. "No thanks. I'd rather keep my head clear." "Come on, Albert. It's just a party," Mason prodded. But I stayed firm. "I'm good, thanks." Mason shrugged, saying, "Suit yourself." He turned to Beverly, confirming, "You guys are off next week, right?" She nodded, smiling, and he leaned close, blowing smoke her way. She took a breath of it and let out a small cough. "Wow, that's strong," she laughed, looking carefree in a way I didn't quite recognize. Mason passed the joint back, glancing my way. "This guy here," he said, gesturing to me, "is the best business analyst we've got. Saved us millions." Beverly smiled warmly at him, and I noticed her expression held more than casual friendliness. "Think of her as my work wife," Mason added, patting her bare thigh, his hand lingering a bit too long. I thought I saw his hand slip slightly under her dress before he pulled it back, leaving me with a troubling sense of uncertainty. "I'd be lost without her," Mason added, casting a smug smile in Beverly's direction. "So would I replied, watching as Beverly lowered her gaze. A heavy silence filled the room, and I finally excused myself, needing a moment alone. "First door on the left," Mason directed. In the bathroom, I looked at myself in the mirror, my mind racing. Could Beverly actually be cheating on me with Mason? Alan's words echoed in my mind. Pay attention to the details. Her bold dress, the change in her behavior around Mason, the pills I'd seen her take, Mason's work wife comment. It was all starting to add up. I felt a creeping suspicion and resolved to find out more. I might even have him out there, working for me on the streets. Shame Alan can't see his golden boy falling apart. Mason sneered, bitterness edging his voice. "So is that why you hate him?" Beverly asked, sounding genuinely curious. "It's all I ever heard growing up." Mason spat. How Albert balanced school, service, all that crap. Sometimes I wondered if Dad would have preferred him as a son over me. But guess what, Dad? I'm in charge now, and by next week, your perfect Albert will be nothing but a wreck. The group laughed, voices echoing Mason's twisted vision. Mason turned to Beverly. "What about you? Are you with us? Because if you're not, you'll end up on the streets, too." Without hesitation, she replied, "I'm with you, babe. I've come to like this way too much to leave now." The group cheered, taking her loyalty as yet another sign of Mason's sway over her. "Good," Mason said with a grin. "Then let's take this upstairs and really get things started." Beverly laughed, following him. "And don't hold back this time." The bedroom noises continued on the recording, but I couldn't listen any longer. I stopped the video, burying my face in my hands as the weight of the betrayal crashed over me. Pete placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "This is brutal, but we're going to get through it," he said quietly. I nodded, trying to pull myself together. "Thanks, Pete. Remember Sergeant Johnson? He's in Vegas now. Owes me a favor. He can help you lay low." "Fine, but first, let's wire this place up," I replied, starting to focus on the next steps. "Absolutely," Pete agreed, nodding. "And stay sharp." I nodded. "I couldn't do this without you." "We're brothers," he replied simply. "We've got this." I stepped onto the porch with a beer as Pete set up the surveillance equipment throughout the house. He wired each room, tapped the phones, and connected everything to a secure server, giving me the access details and a control switch. "I'll call Johnson tomorrow to set things up," he assured me. "Just don't do anything rash." "I won't," I replied evenly. "Good. Hang in there, buddy," Pete said, patting my back before leaving. Once alone, I logged into our bank accounts. Years ago, I'd set up a private account for emergencies, where I'd quietly saved away a portion of my income. I transferred half of our joint account's balance into it, then canceled our joint credit cards. I still had my personal card from before we were married, more than enough for what I needed now. Packing a bag with clothes for a few days, I loaded it into my car. Back inside, I glanced at our wedding portrait over the fireplace. Anger simmered, and I grabbed my hunting knife, slashing through the canvas and tearing it from the frame. I gathered every photo of Beverly I could find, threw them into the fireplace with her wedding dress, and considered lighting it all. But I wanted her to see this. Instead, I sat at my computer, drafting an email to the board. I outlined everything, emphasizing the legal and reputational risks that Mason posed. Satisfied, I attached the video as evidence and sent it, letting them know I'd be on a brief vacation but reachable by phone or email. By Tuesday, I expected a response. By then, I planned to be far away from this nightmare. I lit a cigarette and watched as Beverly's face blackened and curled in the flames, feeling grim satisfaction with each second. Then, taking her phone, I unlocked it with the code I knew and began scrolling through her messages. What I found made my stomach turn. Their affair had been going on for at least 6 months, but in recent messages, Beverly's tone had turned colder and more disrespectful. I found countless explicit photos, shots of Mason undressed, of them making out, of them dancing closely in nightclubs. Judging by the timestamps, these were from her supposed business trips to New York. The videos were worse, capturing Beverly in a range of acts with Mason and others. It was all clear now. Anger and disgust surged through me. I copied everything and sent it to myself, erasing the sent messages. When I was done, I downed 6 beers and smoked half a pack of cigarettes, stubbing them out on her photos, each burn a small release of rage. As dawn broke, I knew she would wake soon to an empty house. I loaded a shotgun, locked the front door, and lay down on the couch, hoping for a little rest. At 8:30 a.m., Beverly woke up and, bleary-eyed, saw the time. She went to the bathroom to freshen up, returning to find Mason awake as well, throwing on a robe with a smug grin. "Why don't you go down and make coffee? Albert might need it if he's up." "Sure," she replied, slipping on a robe and heading downstairs. She started the coffee and walked into the living room, only to find the blanket tossed aside, his shoes gone. Panic shot through her. She frantically searched the house, but he was nowhere. Glancing outside, she saw his car was gone and his wedding ring lying on her purse. "Oh, crap," she whispered, racing back upstairs. "What's wrong?" Mason asked as she burst in. "He's gone," she said breathlessly. "What do you mean gone?" "He woke up and left. He took the car and left his ring. Call him and get him back here," Mason ordered, though a hint of worry crept into his voice. Beverly hurried downstairs, clutching Albert's ring, but when she reached for her phone, she realized it was missing. "Where's my phone?" she murmured, panic rising. Mason came down as well. "My phone's gone," she stammered. "It's full of texts, pictures, everything. If he has it, he's seen everything." "Stop panicking. Just call him from the house phone and get him back," Mason replied, though his tone held a note of tension. Beverly picked up the house phone and dialed Albert's number, her hands trembling. "Hello?" Albert answered, his voice cold and unfamiliar. "Sweetheart, it's me," she said, trying to sound casual. "What do you want?" he growled, his tone sharp and unforgiving. She flinched. He'd never spoken to her this way. "Honey, I woke up and didn't see you here. I got worried. Are you okay?" "Why would you care?" Albert's voice dripped with mockery. "Need a ride back from Mason's place. Who could actually last in a country where you're still so young? I was born deaf, you know. Call an Uber and come here alone. If Mason or anyone else shows up, I'll shoot them on sight. Understand?" Beverly's heart was pounding. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll call an Uber." "Good. Bring cash or an ATM card, too," he added curtly. "Why?" she asked, feeling more confused. "Because your credit card's been cancelled," he replied icily. "Oh." She could barely process what was happening. "And by the way, I found your phone. Quite an interesting collection of photos and videos in there. I know what you've been up to on those business trips. They'll be very useful for the divorce." "Oh my God, Albert, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you," she began, but he cut her off. "Save it, Beverly. If you want to talk, come alone." He hung up, leaving her staring at her phone in horror. "What did he say?" Mason asked, noting her pale face. "He's not coming here. He wants me to go alone, and he said if anyone else shows up, he'll shoot." Mason's expression darkened as he weighed their options. Then, with a steely glint in his eye, went to his study and came back with a small syringe. "You know what to do," he said, handing it to her. Beverly took a deep breath, slipped the syringe into her purse, and nodded. "All right. Just promise you won't hurt him." Mason exchanged a glance with his friends, who chuckled and nodded. "We'll do our best," he replied. Beverly called for an Uber, scheduled to arrive in 30 minutes, and then went upstairs to finish getting ready. Meanwhile, Mason and his friends planned to follow her in a separate car parked down the street, unaware of the white van parked discreetly across the road. A few minutes later, my phone rang. It was Pete. "What's up?" I answered quietly. "My team intercepted a conversation between your wife and her friends," Pete informed me. "She's getting an Uber, and they're planning to tail her. She's got the syringe with her, ready to go. We'll track them." "Damn," I muttered, feeling the weight of their plan hit me. "Yeah, stay sharp. I'll text you when they're on the move. Get your surveillance set up before she gets there. I'm close by, and I'll call the cops if things go south. Just be ready." "Got it," I replied, feeling a cold determination settle over me. About half an hour later, a text from Pete read, "They're on the move. Showtime." I checked my surroundings, hid the shotgun where Beverly wouldn't easily find it, and set up the surveillance in the kitchen. Grabbing a Ziploc bag for the syringe, I watched from the window as the Uber pulled up and Beverly emerged, clutching her purse tightly. I grinned, opened the door, and turned to the fireplace, where I had lit her wedding dress and our photos aflame. The first thing Beverly noticed was the smoke and the sight of the fabric burning. Her face contorted in shock, her eyes widening at the flames licking at the photos and her dress. "You're burning my wedding dress and our photos. Why would you do this?" she choked, tears streaming down her face. I said nothing at first, just watched her impassively. "I wanted you to see what you've destroyed," I finally replied. She looked around, noticing the beer bottles and cigarette butts scattered around. "You never could drink much, and you quit smoking. Drinking makes me mean, and smoking was just a habit I put away, until now," I replied coldly. "Kind of like you did, choosing to follow Mason." She started to break down. "Oh my God, what have I done?" "Good question. You tell me. You used to be kind, Beverly. Now using coke, sleeping with other men, threatening me with drugs? Who are these people?" "Mostly clients," she admitted quietly. "Mason, he made me." "Made you? Your actions could bring down Harper Investments. Was it also Mason's idea to drug me?" I asked, my gaze filled with disgust. She looked genuinely shocked. I didn't. Enough." I played the recording of her planning to drug and abduct me. Her face went ashen, hearing her own words. How did you get that?" "It doesn't matter. What matters is that the board and the police have it too. We're divorcing, and if I get my way, you'll spend a long time in prison." She was trembling now. You don't understand. It's a long story. Maybe you'll tell me someday, when I'm not tempted to strangle you. I saw her hand inching toward her purse. In an instant, I grabbed it, emptying its contents onto the coffee table. The syringe rolled out, and I carefully picked it up with a tissue. Is this what you plan to use on me? Do you even know what's in it? Not exactly, she whispered. Not exactly, I echoed, incredulous. So you'd inject me with God knows what, because Mason said so? Let me guess, you were to inject me and then call him to come take care of me? She nodded, her eyes downcast. Fine, make the call, and no tricks. Shakily, she picked up her phone, dialed Mason, and put it on speaker. Mason, it's me. Beverly. It's done. He's out. Good girl, Mason replied smoothly, ending the call. Beverly looked at me, panicked. He'll kill me when he finds out you're awake. Too bad, I replied with a shrug. Remember, no signals, or I'll handle you myself. I reclined in my chair, half closing my eyes as Mason and his accomplices approached the door. As they entered, Mason scanned the room, noting the mess and the burning photos. Nice work, Beverly, he said approvingly. Now let's get him in the trunk. As he reached for me, I sprang to life, lunging forward and striking his throat. He staggered back, gasping, and I followed with a sharp kick, sending him to the floor. Before the others could react, Pete and his team burst in, guns drawn. They quickly restrained Mason and his friends, handcuffing each of them as they struggled. Pete glanced over, giving me a nod. All clear. Thanks, Pete, I replied, glancing at Beverly, who stood frozen in horror. Pete approached Mason, who lay clutching his throat, gasping in pain. Albert stepped forward, grabbing Mason's hair and pressing a hunting knife to his neck. Better make your peace, Albert growled. I'm ready to end you right here. Mason's eyes widened in terror, and a wet stain appeared on his pants. Beverly shrank back, horrified. Just as Albert pressed the blade to Mason's throat, Pete's voice cut through sharply. Stand down, Sergeant. Put the knife away. Police are on their way. Albert clenched his jaw. He deserves to die, he growled, fury thick in his voice. Pete knelt in front of Mason, keeping his gaze on Albert. You're right, he does. But if you do this, you'll be the one behind bars. Let justice handle it the right way. Albert's rage faltered, and with a shaky breath, he lowered the knife and stepped back. Pete quickly zip-tied Mason and then Beverly. Tears streaked her face as she glanced toward the fireplace, where a wedding photo of her and Albert was almost consumed by flames. Albert sank back onto the couch, stunned and silent as Pete efficiently restrained the men. Outside, Pete's team detained the other three sprawled on the lawn. Sirens grew louder as police arrived, and Pete turned to Albert. Hand me your phone, he said. I'll brief the officers. Albert handed it over, watching as Pete went outside to meet the police. Meanwhile, Mason, pale and trembling, glanced up at Albert, his voice barely audible. My father always liked you more than me, he muttered. Albert's expression was unreadable. That's not true. He just wanted you to step up. Mason's eyes widened with fear. Would you really have done it? Killed me? Albert's lips thinned into a cold line. Guess you'll never know. But where you're headed, Pleasant will make sure plenty of people don't hesitate. If you ever come near me again, I won't hesitate either. Mason's face crumpled as he looked away. At that moment, 3 police officers entered, quickly surveying the scene. They read Mason and Beverly their rights and escorted them out. One officer picked up a syringe from the coffee table, now sealed in a plastic evidence bag. "Is this what they plan to use on you?" the officer asked, looking at Albert. Albert nodded. "Yes," he replied, his voice steady. The officer took Albert's statement, his tone serious. "Good thing you had people watching your back." "No," Albert said firmly. "I had my brother in arms." The officer gave a small smile, shaking Albert's hand. "Semper Fi." "Hurrah!" Albert responded, feeling a weight lift as the officers left. Once the police were gone, Pete returned inside, scanning the aftermath. "Got another one of those?" he asked, nodding toward the beer bottles on the table. "Think there's one or two left," Albert said, grabbing one for Pete. Pete twisted off the cap and took a long sip. "Bit early, don't you think?" Albert raised an eyebrow. "After what just happened?" Pete nodded, taking another swig. "How are you holding up?" Albert shrugged, his voice hollow. "Feels like I've been through another war. I could use time to decompress." "Figured," Pete said, pulling out a business card and handing it to Albert. "Talk to Gunny. He's got a place in Vegas where you can lay low. Here's his number." Albert took the card, nodding slowly. "Appreciate it." Pete handed him another card, this one for a divorce attorney named Michelle Hawkin. "Got this set up too. She's waiting for you at 8 a.m. on Monday. Doesn't tolerate cheaters, so she'll take your case personally." "Thanks, Pete," Albert said, the full weight of everything settling over him. "Semper Fi, brother. We're all in this together," Pete said, lifting his bottle. Albert raised his own in a silent toast. "Hoorah," he said, though his voice was weary. They drank in silence, and eventually Pete stood, giving the room a quick once-over. "You've got some cleanup ahead. I'll swing by later to pick up the surveillance gear." With that, Pete left, and Albert was alone to start putting his life back in order. That afternoon, Albert's phone rang. The caller ID read * David Matt, Interim CEO, Harper Financial. "Albert, it's David," came the voice on the line. "Yes, Mr. Matt. What can I do for you?" "Just call me David. We reviewed the footage and your letter. It was eye-opening." "Thank you, David." "You're welcome. We've decided to terminate both Beverly and Mason immediately, given everything. I'll be handling the paperwork at the county jail myself," David said, his tone firm. "There's more." Albert braced himself. "What else?" "The board wants you to take some time off to clear your head. Do you have somewhere to go?" "Yeah, I have a place in Vegas lined up. After my divorce lawyer meeting on Monday, I'll head out." "Perfect. Take all the time you need. We'll see you back in the office a week from Monday." "Thank you, David. One more thing," David added. "The board unanimously agreed you're the best person to take over Mason's position." Albert was stunned. "Me?" "Yes, you handled this with integrity. We're lucky to have you." Albert exhaled. "I appreciate that." "Enjoy your time off. We'll see you soon," David said before hanging up. Albert ended the call, feeling a mix of relief and renewed purpose. He spent the rest of the day cleaning the house, even mowing the lawn to clear his mind. Later, he called Gunny Johnson. "So you're coming to Vegas?" Gunny asked, sounding pleased. "Yeah, I need a change of scenery," Albert replied. "Good. I'll set you up. Just remember, it's Vegas, not Bangkok," Gunny teased. They both laughed. "Noted," Albert said with a grin. That evening, Pete dropped by to pick up the surveillance equipment. "Quick update," he said. "The cops searched Mason's place, found drugs, explicit videos, and more dirt. He's in deep trouble." "Good riddance," Albert muttered. Pete stayed for dinner, and after a long conversation, Albert fell asleep, completely drained. The next day, Albert gathered Beverly's belongings into trash bags and stashed them in the garage. He planned to donate them once her legal situation was resolved. On Monday, Albert arrived at Michelle Hawkins's office promptly at 8 a.m. She meticulously went over his case, explaining California's divorce laws. "Since you don't have children and the house was yours before the marriage, you'll likely keep it," she said. "Also, given her criminal charges, the judge may waive spousal support while she's incarcerated." "I appreciate it," Albert said. "Let's make this as quick as possible." Michelle nodded. "I'll draft the papers and arrange for her to be served. If she signs without a fight, we'll present them to the judge, and the divorce will finalize in 6 months." Albert left a retainer and headed to the county jail. In the visitation room, he watched as Beverly entered, looking worn and vulnerable in her orange jumpsuit. Picking up the phone, Albert began, "I've filed for divorce." Beverly's voice was small. "I figured you would. Your arraignment's tomorrow. The prosecutor's pushing for no bail," Albert said, his tone firm. She nodded, then looked up, her eyes pleading. "Can you tell me, honestly, what happened to us?" Albert's jaw tightened. "You tell me. Mason got inside your head, didn't he?" She broke down, recounting how it all began. Albert listened, his emotions a mix of pity and anger. When she finished, Albert said coldly, "Don't expect forgiveness." "I wasn't," Beverly whispered. Albert left the jail without another glance, ready to close this chapter of his life for good. The Marlboro office was bustling. Every case appeared approved on paper, and Mom's certified medical recognition phases were in play. "This is Candy," Gunny said, motioning to the young woman beside him. "She'll be your tour guide while you're here." "Gunny, this really isn't necessary," Albert protested, feeling a little out of his depth. "Listen, son," Gunny replied, resting a reassuring hand on Albert's shoulder. "After everything you've been through, you deserve a break. Relax, have some fun, and remember, what happens here stays here," he added with a sly grin. They chuckled, and with a final pat on Albert's back, Gunny exited the room. Albert turned to Candy, raising an eyebrow. "So are you an escort?" "Not anymore," Candy replied with a soft smile. "Thanks to Gunny, I'm out of that life. I'm in school now, working a regular job. He mentioned you and asked if I'd show you around. If you're not comfortable, I can leave. No pressure." Albert shook his head. "Gunny's probably right. I could use some company. And you're a lovely woman. How about we start with a drink?" Candy's smile widened. "That sounds nice." The evening passed at a club, with drinks, dancing, and conversation. For the first time in a long while, Albert felt his burdens lighten. When they returned to his room, Candy's gentle companionship offered him a rare sense of peace. The next morning, Albert woke to find her still beside him. After a shared shower, Candy got dressed. "I've got classes today," she explained, adjusting her bag. "But I can meet you here tonight, if you'd like." "Perfect," Albert said, kissing her goodbye. Albert spent his morning downstairs, trying his luck at the casino, taking Gunny's advice. He walked away with $300, which he later decided to give to his wife. The magic of the town's charm lingered. Yet Albert knew nothing serious would come of his time with Candy. She had a bright future ahead, while he carried too much baggage. Still, as he drove home, he smiled at the thought of her, thankful for the escape she provided. Once home, Albert caught up on Beverly and her accomplices' legal troubles. After reviewing the prosecution's evidence, the judge ordered all of them held without bail. Michelle, his attorney, confirmed that Beverly signed the divorce papers as soon as she received them. In 6 months, he'd finally be free of her. By Monday, Albert returned to work, where his belongings were already set up in Mason's old office. Colleagues greeted him warmly, congratulating him on his promotion. His new assistant, Marcia Bowden, whom he'd known for years, was already organizing his schedule. Professional and capable, Marcia never once mentioned Beverly's scandal. As Albert dug into the audit, troubling discrepancies in Mason's financial records surfaced. Expense accounts were bloated, especially during trips Mason and Beverly had taken. Worse, Mason's mishandling of client accounts had triggered an SEC investigation, leading to federal charges. Over the following months, Albert and David worked relentlessly to repair the damage. Despite difficult conversations with disgruntled clients, their quick action retained the firm's clientele. Meanwhile, Albert kept in occasional contact with Candy through emails. One day she shared that she'd met someone at school and was getting serious. Albert wasn't surprised, but felt a bittersweet pang. He wished her happiness, grateful for the memories. Around the same time, the trial for Beverly, Mason, and their co-conspirators dragged on, with mounting charges and legal maneuvers. Albert took the stand despite Beverly's defense team's efforts to deter him. "I may not be required to testify against her," Albert told her lawyer, "but I want to. Soon she won't even be my wife." The jury visibly reacted to Albert's testimony, especially when video evidence from the night of the party revealed the depth of the conspiracy. The verdict day arrived, and the packed courtroom held its breath as the jury foreman confirmed their decision. The judge read the charges, including conspiracy to kidnap and assault. Mason also faced additional charges for drugs and illicit materials. The verdict? Guilty on all counts for all 5 defendants. Sentencing was set, and the convicted were let out. At sentencing, the judge condemned the group's actions, handing down heavy sentences. Mason's accomplices each received 20 years, Beverly was sentenced to 25 to life, and Mason got 50 to life, with additional federal charges pending. Beverly sobbed as she was led away while Mason appeared defeated. 6 months later, Mason met a grim fate in prison. His arrogance had earned him deadly enemies. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if the story was interesting.